Hello and welcome everyone to this video podcast for evolution and diversity. This will be the first of 3 videos that will talk about the diversity of animals. And in the video today, we're going to cover these 2 objectives. The first one is to identify and distinguish features of the non-bilaterians. And the non-bilaterians are these first 3 phyla: Porifera, Ctenophora, and Cnidarians. The rest of the phylum listed here are bilaterians. So the second objective is going to be looking at this first group of bilaterians. And they belong to this group that we call Lophotrochozoans. And they include the Rotifera, Platyhelminthes, Annelida, and the Mollusca. In the next video podcast, we will cover the ectozoas. Let's go ahead though and get started with our discussion of the 3 non-bilaterians. And as I said before, we'll talk about the Porifera, the Ctenophora, and the Cnidarians. In doing so, we'll talk about some common synapomorphies of each of them, how they feed, their movement, reproduction, and cover some other interesting facts. Some of this we've mentioned in passing, but this will be a nice way to bring all that information together within each of the phyla. We've probably talked about Porifera more than most of the phyla over the first few videos for animals. But remember, they include the sponges, as shown in this picture here. Some synapomorphies we've already talked about, but let's go ahead and talk about them again. Remember, the Porifera are the one phyla of animal that lacks some of the common features we see in all the other phyla. For instance, they don't have any tissues, they have no symmetry, no muscles, and they don't have a nervous system. What all Porifera do have, though, is that they all have these specialized cells called the choanocytes. And we've talked about these before. And remember, they are these flagellated cells here that help in feeding. And we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. They also contain these specialized structures here called spicules. They're shown here in yellow in these images up here. And these are stiff spikes that protrude from the different porifera. And they're made of compounds like calcium carbonate, silica, or spongin. All of the species in porifera are benthic, which means they live at the bottom of the sea and they're attached to the bottom of the sea. Now, when we think about the feeding behavior of species found in porifera, we say they are suspension feeders. Another word for this would be filter feeders, which is a little bit more self-explanatory because suspension feeders obtain their food by filtering the water that they live in. And in doing so, they can filter in various nutrients or other organisms that they will feed upon. As we've talked about before and on the previous slide, these specialized cells within porifera, the choanocytes, create this current that pushes water through the sponges, and in doing so they bring in various nutrients that these other specialized cells called the Amoebocytes trap those nutrients and phagocytize them to bring those nutrients into the cells. So this video is going to show how water is filtered through the sponges and then leaves through the top. And if there's any nutrients in the water, it will trap it inside the sponge. But what they're going to show here is a dye. So you can see that the dye is going to go through there and it'll pop out the top. So you can see it, these choanocytes create quite a filter pushing that water through the sponges. And then here's a bigger sponge example using the same kind of dye. Again, creating that same kind of current going through the sponge. All right, let's think about the movement of the different species of porifera. In general, we think of the adults as being sessile. That's because they are. They don't move as adults, as you saw in the previous videos. However, all animals at some point in their life cycle are motile. And for porifera, that is the larval stage. They do swim. And that brings us to our next topic for porifera, and that is reproduction. Now, species within the phylum Porifera can reproduce asexually or sexually. When they reproduce asexually, they do so by forming buds. And you can see that happening right down here, where the small little bud is forming off of the much larger parent. It will then fall off and will float to the bottom and attach to the bottom and begin to grow into an adult. They can also reproduce sexually, as I said, and in doing so, they are monoecious. Fertilization can either be internally or externally, though usually it is externally. And remember, since they're monoecious, that means each animal within the species Porifera will have male and female reproductive structures, so they will produce both the egg and sperm. As I said, usually fertilization happens externally, outside of the parent. It will form an embryo, and then this embryo will pass through this larval stage, shown here and here. And remember, I said the larval stage is motile, and so it'll continue to move on its own until it settles at the bottom of the sea, where it will attach and begin to grow from this young sponge into an adult sponge. So some things about sponges you should know. They can live for over 200 years. As part of their defense, sponges produce chemicals to deter predators from eating them. Once we discovered this, scientists started looking to see if these chemicals could be used for any medicinal purpose. And it turns out that these chemicals are being studied for their anti-cancer and their anti-HIV activities. In particular, one of the species, the Alaskan sea sponge, seems to have had some promise as an anti-cancer drug. Sponges are now often made synthetically, but the original sponges, and even the loofahs you buy today, are the actual sponges you find in the oceans. They also tend to be hypoallergenic, and there are many other uses for sponges. Let's now move to our second phylum, the Ctenophora. The Ctenophora include the comb jellies, shown here. Now you can see the Ctenophora are right here. They are still non-bilateral animals, but they do have symmetry. They have radial symmetry, as we talked about before. And as we'll talk about in a moment, they also have tissues. They are diploblasts, so they make ectoderm and endoderm during their embryonic development. So let's talk about some of the features of the Ctenophora. One of the main synapomorphies for Ctenophora are these cells called coloblasts. And you can see the coloblasts right here. And here's a blown up picture of it. And the unique feature of these coloblasts is that they have these sticky cells at the end of them for trapping prey. Unlike the Cnidarians, which we'll talk about next, the Ctenophora do not have stinging capabilities. Ctenophora also are all transparent. When we think about Ctenophora feeding, they tend to be harmless to humans, but they are very efficient predators. Using those coloblasts, they can trap a zooplankton here and bring it into the body of the Ctenophora, the comb jelly. Now let's talk about how Ctenophora move. Now most Ctenophora are planktonic, and they can move, as we'll see in this video here, using rows of cilia. In fact, they're the largest known animal to move solely by cilia. As we'll see in a moment, I'm going to tell you that they're bioluminescent, and that's how we can see them as such. And these beating fluorescent structures here are the cilia, and this allows the comb jelly to move. Alright, now let's think about the reproduction of the comb jelly. Most of these reproduce sexually. However, they are monoecious, again meaning that they have both male and female reproductive structures. Fertilization is external, and just like we saw with the Poriferas, they do have this free-living larvae intermediate stage. An interesting fact about Ctenophora, the comb jellies, is that they are bioluminescent. They live in the depths of the oceans, where we see a lot of bioluminescent organisms. Let's go ahead and move to our last non-bilateral phylum, the Cnidarians. This includes the jellyfish, the sea anemones, and the corals. As I just said, they're the last of the phylum that we're going to talk about that do not have a bilateral symmetry. But just like the Ctenophora, they do have the radial symmetry that we've talked about before. So let's talk about some of the features of the Cnidarians, which includes the jellyfish, the corals, and the sea anemones. One of the main synapomorphies that we see with the Cnidarians is that they have these cells called cnidocytes. At the tips of them, they are barbed, and these barbs contain toxins that can be used to capture prey. If you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, or you know someone that's been stung by a jellyfish, these are the cells, the cnidocytes, that sting them, and it can be quite painful. That brings us to feeding behaviors of Cnidarians, and they are very efficient predators. And in this video here, I'm going to be able to show you how these tentacles, shown right here, are going to reach out and attach a prey right down here. So let's see what's happening here. You can see the cnidocyte cells moving towards it, and this cell, this organism here, probably some kind of zooplankton, is moving quite well here until those barbs touch it. And you can see it's very efficient. The animal quickly quits moving and dies. And now what you're going to see is these tentacles pulling in the prey into the body of this jellyfish. And in this video down here on the bottom here, it shows a kind of a close-up of it. And here is that prey being brought in, and you're going to see it get consumed by the mouth of the jellyfish here. It's just going to shove it in there. And it's all gone. Cnidarians, the jellyfish, they will move by what looks like jet propulsion, and they use muscle contractions by the jellyfish. Now, the jellyfish don't have the mesoderm layer, so they don't have the true muscle tissue, but they do have those contractile cells that help move the jellyfish. And so let's look at this video here. So it just pushes up and moves the jellyfish in an upward and longitudinal movement. It's actually kind of cool looking as you watch it. Just don't get stung by it. Jellyfish live all over the different oceans, and in fact, many of them are thriving throughout the oceans, even in areas where coral and sea anemones are not doing as well. Okay, let's now move to the reproduction cycles of cnidarians. Most of the cnidarians reproduce asexually, and they do so by budding. And so you can see here, this is a bud coming off of the parent cell here. They will also reproduce sexually. And some species are monoecious, meaning again that female and male reproductive structures are in the same organism, but some are also dioecious, where different organisms will have either male or female reproductive structures. So let's consider the life cycle of the cnidarians. A jellyfish, for instance. They will alternate between this polyp stage here, which reproduces asexually, but they can also produce one of these free-floating medusas, and the medusas reproduce sexually. So they will produce an egg and a sperm, and they will fertilize the egg, producing the zygote, which will form a larvae, shown here, and the larvae will settle to the bottom, where it will form a young polyp stage that will eventually grow in an adult polyp stage. And as an adult, it will either reproduce asexually by budding off new polyps, or sexually by producing the medusas. This alternating between the polyp and the medusa stage is only seen in jellyfish. The sea anemones and corals only reproduce asexually using the polyp stage. Some interesting facts about the cnidarians. Some of them are bioluminescent, like we saw with the comb jellies. In addition, jellyfish and sea anemones can be used as a source of food for humans. In fact, some of these turn out to be quite a delicacy in some cultures. Now, the venom that is produced by the cnidarians is very effective, and every time we find an organism, be it a jellyfish or a venomous snake, scientists like to study that venom because it turns out that it can often have some useful medicinal purposes, and that's true with the venom found in jellyfish as well. An interesting medicine that has come out of the study of jellyfish is this protein called apoaquarum that is thought to help improve memory in humans. One last interesting fact about the cnidarians is that within the cnidarians, Hydra do not appear to age. Now we're going to move into our discussion of the Bilaterians. Remember, the Bilaterians have the symmetry where they have one plane of symmetry. So all of these listed down here are Bilaterians, and we're going to break up our discussion into first talking about Lophotrochozoas here, and then in the next video we're going to talk about Ectodozoa species here. And in the third video we're going to talk about the Echinodermata and the Chordatas. But first let's move into the Lophotrochozoas. But before we do that, I want to distinguish between these two groups of animals. The Lophotrochozoas are classified in this group because they all contain a structure called a lophophore, which we'll talk about in a moment, that is used for feeding, and a unique larval form called a trochophore. The ectozozoas possess an exoskeleton that can be shed. So that's what distinguishes this group. And we'll talk about these, as I said, in the next video podcast. And as I said on the previous slide, all of the phylum in the Lophotrochozoans have a lophophore, which is right here. It's a ring that is surrounded by ciliated tentacles that you can see protruding up here. And again, this is used for feeding. And then all of these phylum that we're going to talk about that are clustered into the Lophotrochozoans have a larval stage that's unique that we call the trochophores. And these larvae can swim and they can feed, much like we see in other ones. But they have this unique structure where they have these cilia surrounding them that are used for movement and feeding. They don't develop the lophophores until they're an adult. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin with our first phylum in the Lophotrochozoas, and that is the phylum of the Rotiferas. One of the most distinguishing features of the Rotifera are the ciliated corona. So corona means crown, so this is at the head of the Rotifera. And the cilia spin at a fairly high rate here, and it creates this vortex of water being rushed into the organism. And as that water is being rushed into the organism, food is also being pushed into it. It has, as you see in this picture here, a primitive brain with an eye spot. So it's not like an eye like you or I have, but it is an eye spot that can sense. It has a digestive tract with a stomach and the ability to digest food within inside the organism. So here's another picture of the Rotifera feeding. And so you can see the ciliated corona up on top here. And you can see the digestive system actually working as food is being brought into the Rotifera. Now the Rotifera move in a couple different ways. They move in what we might call a creeping motion using muscles. And this video here on the left demonstrates that pretty well. And so you can see what's happening here. On the top end here, the organism sticks to the surface, and then the body extends its muscles in a particular direction. And so I'm going to stop it here. So you can see how it's attached here. The Rotifera moves forward, relaxing its muscles. And then what happens is it's going to contract those muscles. And at that time, it's going to release its hold on the surface, pulling its back into it. So it attaches, releases, attaches, releases. And in this way, it can move fairly well in a particular direction. Over here, the video on the right shows Rotifera moving using their ciliated corona. Can't really see the cilia in here, but that's how they're moving because they're not attached to a surface. The reproduction of Rotifera is either asexual or sexual. So let's look at the sexual reproduction first. It's dioecious, so it has separate organisms with male and separate organisms with female reproductive structures. Each will make an egg or a sperm that is fertilized, just as you would expect. Now, adult females can also participate in asexual reproduction using parthenogenesis, where they will have that haploid egg, but it undergoes a mitotic division, making it diploid. And then that diploid egg can then behave as a fertilized zygote and produce progeny from there. Some species of Rotifera have been extremely successful throughout evolution using just parthenogenesis as their means of reproduction. Some interesting facts about Rotiferas. They're the smallest animals on Earth and have the shortest life cycle. As I mentioned in the opening slide with the Rotifera, they do have a primitive brain and a primitive eye. They can survive in this quiescent state for years without water. Interesting, male rotiferas do not eat. Many rotiferas are parasitic, but they're not parasitic to humans. So they're relatively harmless to us. But they do live inside several protists, like the Volvox. Now let's go to the Phylum Platyhelminthes. And we're going to talk about three types here: the flukes, the planaria, and the tapeworms. These are commonly referred to as the flatworms. The name Platyhelminthes means flatworm. Platy means flat, and helminthes means worm. They're found in aquatic or moist environments. So if you remember, what advantage might this flat body have for members of the Platyhelminthes? Remember that they have gas exchange through the surface of their bodies. And so, by having a nice flat body, it increases their surface area. And this increased surface area increases gas exchange. And so that is likely the reason they have this flat body. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the feeding of the Platyhelminthes. In this video, I'm going to show you a planarian. And it's a carnivore, so you're going to see it crawling over a various meat source that it's going to feed upon. You're going to see this protrusion coming out of its abdomen, and this protrusion is its feeding tube. It's this extendable pharynx that it will use in order to feed upon the meat. So let's go ahead and watch this. So here's the planarian. Here's its head, searching for food, and here's that protruding pharynx I told you about. And it pokes out here and looks for food as the planarian is moving around. Here's a food source here, and here are two planarian, and you can see a pharynx extending out here on this one on the bottom, and this one on top has a pharynx coming out on the top, and it's going to feed upon that food source. Next, let's talk about the next groups here, the flukes and the tapeworms. Now, flukes and tapeworms are all parasites, and tapeworms are unique in the fact that they don't have a digestive system. And I'd like to look at a video of a tapeworm. If you have a sensitive stomach, you may not want to watch this and may want to just speed up a little bit. But this will be a video of a tapeworm in a human's small intestines. So here's the inside of a small intestines. And you can see right along here, the very thin and flat structure here, that is the tapeworm. And this particular tapeworm is about 2 meters long, and it extends through the small intestines. And as it gets deeper, it gets a little bit more mature, and it's thicker. I'm going to hit pause here. And you can see how it is attached to the small intestines. And remember, it doesn't have a digestive system. So it's just pulling those nutrients from the small intestines, from our bodies, in order to survive. When it reproduces, it produces new tapeworms within the small intestines, and they too can attach to the small intestines and feed from the same hosts. Often the way this is diagnosed is as new tapeworms are being produced or parts of the existing tapeworm fall off, they can be found in fecal samples. So we'll keep watching this and just see how far it extends down the small intestines. And there's actually a second tapeworm in this person too that is also about 2 meters in length. And this is showing that second tapeworm. Okay, let's go and move to how members of the Platyhelminthes move. They essentially will glide over a slime track that will use their cilia and muscles to pull them across. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video here. So they're attached to the surface, and by muscle contraction and relaxation, they will push themselves, they will glide themselves across the surface here. Okay, let's talk about the flatworm's reproduction. Now, most often, flatworms will produce asexually, and that is by fission. So a flatworm here, you could actually cut into 3 different pieces: a head, this abdominal region, and the tail region. And rather shockingly, what will happen is each of these 3 segments will form a brand new adult flatworm. They can also reproduce sexually. And they are monoecious in their sexual reproduction, and they will have, meaning that they will have both female and male reproductive structures in the same organism. They are true hermaphrodites. Interestingly enough, when you look at the Platyhelminthes, some of them, like the Turbellarians, can actually be trained to solve certain mazes. Turbellarians are attracted to certain kinds of vibrations that happen, such as when things are dropped into water. Though this is not recommended, throughout history, tapeworms have been used to help people lose weight. This is a horrible idea, and this is not how one should lose weight. But you can look up online of the history of how tapeworms have been used in this way. Marine flukes, shown down here, are often very colorful and participate in a very interesting sexual reproduction, which I'm going to show on this next slide. And this is referred to as penis fencing. Sounds humorous, but it's a very interesting thing that happens here. And so I'm going to just let the person narrating it narrate what's happening here. So I'll just be quiet for a little bit, and you can listen to what's happening here with the flukes and their penis fencing.
Flatworms have both male and female sex organs. But when it comes time to make little flatworms, they have to decide who plays which role. And that they fight over. The two flatworms rear up, exposing their midsections. Those jutting white nibs aren't weapons, at least not intentional ones. They are actually the worm's penises, a double-barreled inseminator, if they can shoot first. Flatworm sex consists of the two attempting to stab their lover with their pointed pair and inseminate each other, an act delicately referred to as penis fencing. But there's nothing delicate about it. Flatworms have been known to gouge holes in each other in battles lasting up to an hour. Why do they cross swords? Producing offspring requires a lot of energy. The winning father can go out and about in the world without any further responsibility. The losing mother absorbs the winner's sperm. It must now work longer and harder to find food and stay alive. The father floats merrily along. The mother crawls along looking for a meal, already the responsible one.
So you can see in this very elaborate battle to decide which fluke will actually be the one that has to carry the progeny, that there is an evolutionary advantage to winning versus losing in this case. Okay, let's go ahead and move to our next phylum, and this is the phylum of the Annelidas. They are the segmented worms. Many of these you might have already seen, including the earthworm. You've probably seen leeches, at least in videos or in pictures, and marine worms, which maybe you have or have not seen before. As the being segmented worms, it probably will not be surprising to learn that their main synapomorphy is that they have these linear arrays of similar segments. And so here you see each of these segments have a very similar structure found in each of them, including an open space, the coelom, a capillary network, and the excretory system here. They have a variety of feeding mechanisms depending on the member of Annelida that you're looking at. They can be deposit feeders, which is just another way of saying that they're detritivores, feeding off of debris that might be on the ground. They can be suspension feeders, those that use a filtering system for feeding. Some are parasitic and some are predators, so they have a wide range of feeding. Now, members of Annelida, they will have a movement that you might be familiar with because most of us have seen a worm moving along the ground. But that's the result of alternating contractions of these circular muscles that go around the worm and longitudinal muscles that extend the length of the worm. And so let's just watch this video showing how these worms move. They contract and then they release. and is this coordination all along the length of the worm. The annelids have a very wide variety of ways that they reproduce, depending upon the type that you're looking at. They can reproduce asexually by various means, including fragmentation, like we saw with the Platyhelminthes, and also by parthenogenesis. Some of the worms, like the polychaetes, they are dioecious, meaning that they have separate male and female organisms. However, oligochaetes and leeches, when they reproduce sexually, they are monoecious, meaning that each individual has male and female reproductive structures. So some interesting facts about annelidas, that some of them can get quite long. In fact, some of them can be 22 feet in length. If you take 1 acre of land and you counted all the earthworms that were present, you would probably count over 1 million earthworms. So suffice to say, they are very numerous. Now, some of these deep sea polychaetes, because they're in the deep sea, and it's common amongst a lot of deep sea animals, they are bioluminescent. And some of these will live at the hydrothermal vents. Remember, those are the vents at the bottom of the ocean where the temperatures can be extremely hot. Leeches throughout history have been used for medicinal purposes, and to some extent are still used today, but there are records of them being used in ancient Egypt to treat things like infections, skin disorders, dental problems, lots of different sources that they have been used for over time. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about our last phylum, and that is the phylum of the mollusks. This includes gastropoda, which are the snails and the slugs. It includes the chitons here, the cephalopods, which are the squids, the octopi, and nautiluses and cuttlefishes, and then the bivalves, which include the clams, the mussels, the scallops, and the oysters. So it's quite a diverse group of animals. However, they do all have some things in common. So some of the synapomorphies they have is that they will have this muscular foot, which they use to attach to surfaces and to move. They will have this internal visceral mass, and inside of the organism there will be organs, and then they will also have this external gill. They'll also have a mantle covering the top of it here, shown in purple. This mantle will secrete a shell. Now, not all members of the mollusks will have a shell, but those that do, it is secreted from this mantle. But all of them are going to have the mantle. So let's think about mollusks as they feed. The bivalves, like the clams and the mussels, they are suspension feeders. They will receive their nutrients as water flows through them. Some of them will have this structure called a radula. And so essentially this is a feeding appendage that is used to capture food. And others, like the cephalopods, the octopus, and the squid, are predators. And so we can watch this video here showing an octopus, and is using its tentacles to search under the rocks here at the bottom of the sea to find various sources of food. You can see here it has just trapped some prey. And has forced it into its mouth underneath it. They'll have various ways of movement, but we'll look here and see the snails, and they'll move through a series of muscle contractions on that muscular foot at the very bottom of it. So let's take a peek at what's happening here. So it's attaching to the surface, and it's gliding across using that muscular foot. It's pretty speedy. Now let's look at how another member of the mollusks moves, and that's the bivalves. They'll move by burrowing their foot, and they have these valves that help them swim. So let's take a peek at what's happening here. So they're swimming using these valves that they have. And here it goes. And other members of the mollusks, like the octopi, they move by using a jet propulsion or crawling mechanism. So this cavity underneath the mantle will fill with water, and then it forces that water out. And as it forces that water out, the octopus will move in the opposite direction of the water being forced out. Mollusks also have a wide variety of ways to reproduce. A lot of them will still reproduce asexually, and some will do this by parthenogenesis. Many of them, when they reproduce sexually, will be dioecious, having separate males and females, but others still are hermaphrodites, being monoecious. Some interesting facts about the mollusk is that the giant squid can be quite large. In fact, it can be 55 feet long, and they are known to have the largest neurons and eyes of all animals. Giant clams, they can weigh up to 500 pounds. We have known for quite some time that the octopi can be very smart, and they can even solve problems. I don't mean like math problems, but they can solve a problem when they're faced with a particular situation. They learn from previous experiences and can solve problems. And the octopus is a master of camouflage. I remember scuba diving before and not realizing I was even near an octopus, and it would just shoot off, scaring me to death. And here's a great video showing the octopus's ability to camouflage. And as you saw, as it shot away from the scuba diver here, it ejected this ink. So not only can it camouflage, it can distract you as well. And that has led to its very successful evolutionary history. Okay, as I close today's video podcast, you can watch this bunny nuttabranch. It's kind of a fun-looking mollusk. But that's all I have for today. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you reach out to me. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.